Hello, welcome to Video 5 Best Practices. There's some kind of common things that people have discovered through scholarship and research about what a city can do to make its budget work well. The Government Finance Officers Association, which is a national trade organization for finance directors of cities, has come up with a whole list of over 100 best practices in terms of how municipalities should go about budgeting. I'm going to give you 4 examples of this, and then you are going to go to the webpage itself and look at what you kind of think are the best practices and why they might come up with it. So you'll pull up, I'm giving you 4, you'll pull up an additional 3 and kind of explain them in bullet point form. So here are 4 of the principles. Capital planning should take into account the unique features of a community. This can be partly look at the kind of the needs of a community. So Anaheim gets a lot of convention business. Businesses bring people from all over the country and all over the world to Anaheim. It's a popular destination because people can take pre and post vacations and go to Disneyland, etc. And so Anaheim has a need for a convention center. So it makes sense that the city of Anaheim budgets for conventions. Where Seal Beach, on the other hand, just doesn't get all that many conventions because it's just not a destination. So they don't need kind of a convention, dedicated convention bureau. The city of Laguna Woods has almost entirely is made up almost entirely of a retirement community, and so the character of Laguna Woods services the city services it provides are going to skew towards a much older and aging demographic because they just very few children and young families live in Laguna Woods because it's almost entirely Laguna Woods Village, which is the old Leisure World. So that kind of planning needs to take into account. You might need a big senior center to the total population because in Leisure World you might need a convention center in Anaheim, and those are kind of capital um, um, planning issues that have to take into account the unique features of the community. Okay, the next one is investment policy should take into account the long-term health of the fund. So there are some investment opportunities that are pretty steady. I mean, Coca-Cola regularly returns the same dividend year over year, and there's not a whole lot of flexibility. There is also not a huge chance Coca-Cola is going to go out of business all of a sudden. Um, Whereas a startup software firm can be high risk and high reward. I mean, people invested $20,000 in Amazon at the very beginning. Jeff Bezos's brother and sister invested $20,000 in the first year of Amazon, and it blew up into now they're 100 millionaires because of that $2,000 investment. But for every Amazon, there are 100 similar companies that go bust. And so there is a general principle by the Government Finance Officers Association that you should limit or not have any of your money in these high risk, high reward kinds of investments. Okay, another principle, funds should be regularly monitored by the council, but there is a tendency among humans to not stay within policy guidelines if you're not being monitored. You can think about this in terms of a 7-year-old. You can issue the dictate, don't eat more than 2 Oreos, but if they know you're not going to check in on them, they probably won't stop at 2. This is the same thing at a city city government level. That if you're not regularly monitoring what's happening with the money, it's going to be spent in ways that the city council didn't intend it. Okay, final one. The government should develop a communications plan to keep residents informed on how and why money is being spent. And this is basically just communicating, letting residents know, having transparency, and having a formal process for involving citizens, at least in the information loop. And so you can see how all of those things would be important. And then again, you'll go to this website below and look in different categories. The categories are kind of a drop down menu. You click on one, and a whole bunch of subtopics comes up. You'll pick three of those, and you will write a um, bullet point about each one of them, and why they might have them, and that's explained on your lesson. Okay, the next thing is the budget process. So the cities all go through the same basic process in developing a budget. The first stage is preparation. And this is where you develop kind of, the overview of what you want to happen. City councils do this first in terms of making a long-term plan for the city. Sometimes they do this on a long-term basis, like a 10-year plan for the city of X. And sometimes they do it on a yearly basis where the city council gets together, has a retreat, and thinks, okay, what is it we want our city to look like in the next year? From there, the department staff, the Department of Parks and Recreation, the Department of Transportation, come up with their budgets. They can use, last year's budget. They can use projected needs. Come up with a budget that they think that they need. They then submit this to the city manager, who creates a city budget of all of the department requests. So it's a unified budget. Then the city manager forwards it on to the approval process, forwards it on to the city council itself. The city council then publicly debates the budget, they amend it, they add things, they delete things, and citizens are often involved in this level of the budgeting process, where citizens aren't really heavily, don't really have an opportunity to go to the private Parks and Rec meeting where they decide how much money to ask for. It is at the city council approval stage that citizens get to have their say. However, once a budget is approved, it becomes a legally binding document. And a city department legally cannot spend more on than they're budgeted, and they cannot spend money on things that are not specifically allocated. So if you do not have any money in your departmental budget for travel, then you are not allowed to speak to conferences. Even, you're not allowed to divert money from the new swing set to send your people to a conference, for instance. That is a legally binding document. Then you have implementation, and departments will spend money throughout the fiscal year, and they will spend it in different chunks. So there are certain things that happen every month. You have to pay the salaries every month, and so you can divide that over a predictable 12-month process. Other things, though, come in either once a year or in batches. So you are going to buy paper and pens 2, 3, 4 times a year. It's not going to be every single month. And so you have a pot of money, and you can buy that much in office supplies throughout the year, and you can spend it all up front, or you can spend it all at the end, or throughout the year, whatever. There are also things that are one-time expenses. For instance, that Parks and Rec conference that they want to send their managers to. There's probably only one Parks and Rec conference in a year, and so all that entire pot of money has to be spent in one shot. Um, and they kind of on the back end, it's important to have evaluation. And at the municipal level, there are two types of evaluation. One is the city council holds oversight hearings, just like the legislature does, just like Congress does. But in addition, cities have another layer of oversight, and that is through the county and state auditing process. Somebody outside of city government actually comes in and audits the books, makes sure the money is being spent in the way that the legally binding budget required. Okay, the final thing we're going to talk about in this is outsourcing. So there has been a huge trend in the last 15 years or so to try and offload some of the services that are provided by a city to the private sector. Very important to understand the difference between outsourcing and privatization. Privatization is where you take government infrastructure and government services and sell them off to a private business. And at that point, the city, county, state, federal government no longer has any control over it. It is being run entirely for profit without any government oversight. So if you have a stadium, for instance, and the city built the stadium and the city runs the stadium, and the city decides that it's too much hassle or it's too expensive or whatever, and they sell that stadium to a private owner, and then the city no longer has any say. They can't set ticket prices. They can't, the operations are entirely financed and and the revenue goes entirely to the private sector. Outsourcing, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It is a where the city maintains control over the service, but they contract out the service. They can pull the contract if the people aren't meeting the needs. Where you can't pull the privatization if that happens. There's always been some sort of fee for service outsourcing. I mean, this predates the modern outsourcing movement. So, for instance, the cities do not like have a paper mill where they create their own paper, pens and things like that. They actually, buy it at Office Depot, and that's kind of a form of outsourcing. And then there are some services that are provided in small amounts. And so, for instance, if you're building a new city hall, you're going to contract out with a construction company. You're not going to have construction workers sitting around waiting for the next capital project. So, this idea of outsourcing has become kind of a political football, but there's always been some of it. The real big deal, though, is that as the free enterprise model became more prominent in the public sector, that there was a real pressure, largely from conservative elements, to private, to send some of these services to the private sector. The private sector was considered more efficient for a couple of reasons. One is that bureaucratic bloat and kind of intrinsic ways can prevent innovation within a bureaucracy. And so part of the private sector benefits of is